Hello everyone, welcome to Tim J. Leary Studios. It's the first Wednesday of June 2022 and here we are for the monthly art walk at Back Street Art District. It's 5 o'clock, so I'm ready to talk about stuff and have a little libation. A very special whiskey tonight from Ireland. As I'm thinking about my friends over there a lot lately. There we go. So, cheers. So, tonight I thought I would talk about inspiration. How does an artist get inspiration? Where does it come from? What are the influences that we all have? As a docent, I hear about this artist influenced that artist, and in particular right now, there's an exhibit that I'm working on, I'm docenting in, about work of an artist called Leon Polk-Smith, who was better known when he was alive than he is now. But I think there's a resurgence in interest in his work. And in the course of all of this, we hear that he was influenced by Mondrian. We hear that he influenced Ellsworth Kelly, who became much more famous than he did, but doing something similar. And I'm influenced by a lot of the artists that I see. And so I thought I would give that some thought tonight. Because there's a few things that I know and a few things that I like to think about and ponder in regard to that. My own art takes a couple of different directions. There's some of it right here on the wall. This up here, the wood piece, the mixed media, is something I started doing a couple of years ago that I am very interested in doing, the mixed media thing, and I'm not exactly sure where that came from. I have some ideas, I might bring them up tonight. And the collages are very fun to do, and I love putting things together and making them make sense together. So I don't think that artists necessarily copy one another. I think if I'm influenced by a particular artist, sometimes you can really see the influence. We have a little technical difficulty. So sometimes you see the influence, but it's not direct. It could be a little like off-center, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so I'll get back to that, but I think that it's not also just not from one source. I look at art all the time, and I do like a few different styles of art, and I often talk about the fact that I became aware of art around the early 60s, and the most popular, or maybe not most popular, but the infamous work of Jackson Pollock was known at that time. So I have this old, very old edition of the Jansen art history book. And so Jackson Pollock is noted for these action paintings, and the action is his action in splattering the paint and moving them around. So that was something that I was intrigued by as a young man, as a child, with art. And so that's probably my intro into art and what is beautiful, aside from, you know, what was in our church, which was all, you know, all the religious art in the church. But I never thought of them as the same thing at first. But there are a couple other things that started to catch my attention. So in the 60s, earlier than the 60s, but in my mind, the architecture in New York, since I grew up close to New York, was of the Art Deco variety, which I brought this book of Art Deco design. I love the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world. Well, that's an Art Deco building. I love, I'll come back to that. I love things like this, which is, I got to make sure I tell you the truth here. This is a lithograph, and these are, if you haven't noticed yet, birds. And this is a really angular, Art Deco is very angular, very geometric, and I find that very appealing and intriguing. Other things like this here, the Radiator Building by Georgia O'Keeffe here also is a good example of the kind of architecture that was, at least in my mind, I believed it was the most appreciated and the best. And a batik over here on this side. I thought this was pretty interesting. This is sort of the workers' news. It's called Stainless Steel Plaque, Associated Press Building at Rockefeller Center. So, growing up close to New York, we actually did go in sometimes, and so some of that, some of the architecture that we saw there was very influential and very grand as a child. Then there's things about movie palaces. This is the Paramount Theater over here in Oakland, which we've been to, which is a magnificent structure and magnificent on the inside. What a celebration of art and design these buildings are. I saved this photo because I think this tea set or coffee service is so cool. These chrome and silver teapots and coffee pots of that era are sleek and interesting and very cool and very, very modern. So that kind of predisposes me to like other things that are modern, I guess, which then kind of lends itself to things like the Bauhaus. So I'm influenced by the Bauhaus. I'm influenced by Kandinsky, of course, and because you can definitely see that in my work, or I can see it in my work. And Paul Klee, I find interesting. So here's another thing that I like to think about with this, is that I'm not copying. I admire things that I wouldn't do myself in my own art, but there's something about them that I find intriguing. But they're, and I thought about bringing a Basquiat book with me today, and then decided against it because I've shown it a couple of times because I'm so intrigued by his work and by the chaotic appearance of some of his work and how it's disorganized in some ways. Really incredible. I only do that in my sketchbook, and I've never presented a painting that looked like that. And every time I decide to set out to do it, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like me. So I don't do it. But I still think that there's something about that work that is giving me some kind of artistic inspiration. It just doesn't come out in an obvious way. So Paul Klee is, in following with the Art Deco idea and the Bauhaus, does it say this is a work from 1918, very geometric, very architectural, dogmatic composition it's called. It's watercolor on paper on cardboard. So that's all pretty cool. and I find this kind of stuff appealing. I also like things like this. It's really organized. So this one, super organized, not as interesting as this one, because the colors in the middle, I'm calling this the middle, are brighter. And because they're smaller, there's greater intensity about them. They really come out. They create some kind of visual interest in there. So I find that to be an inspiration. But when I sit down to do something geometric, it doesn't come out like that. So maybe something like this here could be appearing in the stitched on, the sewn on pieces of canvas that are, I don't know if you can tell that on the camera, that this piece here is sewn, these pieces are sewn onto the main canvas. And so maybe somehow that's coming out of that, but it's not coming out of that directly. So I guess where I'm going with this is that, you know, you can get inspired by stuff, and it doesn't mean you're going to copy anything. Although, I'm going to show you something in a minute. That was pretty direct, but I'll come back to it. I wanted to show some of this work because I've always been a fan of Miro, and I've read about him. I find his work inspiring and his life inspiring, and yet my work doesn't look like his. But these images here, I think you could maybe focus on this side. These are images. He was a surrealist. I don't think of myself as a surrealist. But there's something about his composition, his sense of composition and proportion, that has always intrigued me. I like these because they look kind of, they almost look unfinished in a way, but they're sort of magical compositions. Intriguing. When I've made a stab at something like this, I didn't like it at all. I walked away. It wasn't me. It wasn't what came out of me. It's just really inspiring, however, to look at and to see how he knew how to put a composition together like this one here. It's one of those things. If I study this, would I change anything? And my answer is, with him, has always been no. There's nothing to change. Here's some more. This might be a little closer to the kind of work that comes out of my arm and my style. I can show examples of that, but parts of it, you know. I love this piece too, but here's something that I don't ever do. I don't ever put text on my paintings or my artwork. Who knows, maybe I'll start doing that one day. But I know a lot of people love to do that. And a lot of people like to see that, but it isn't something that comes out of my mind. And yet, when someone else does it, I can find it inspiring. Okay. So let me set this aside, and let me show you a little bit of Leon Polk Smith. Here. This is from the Palm Springs Art Museum. These are some of the pieces that he's done that we're showing there that I think are really nice. I love this one in particular. It's called Self-Portrait. Don't take it too literally, I'd say. And these are beautiful. Mondrian got him excited enough about doing art that it made him go do his own art. And I think that's a little more like where I'm at with that sort of thing. Excuse me. And so there's a story about Leon Polk Smith and Ellsworth Kelly. They knew each other and apparently didn't get along very well. But someone introduced me to this book, and at a time when I was looking for inspiration. So 10 years ago, it is now 10 years ago this month, that I was in Ireland at the Burren College of Art in Ballyvaughan. And at the same time, my friend Judith had introduced me to this book of Ellsworth Kelly's plant drawings. So Ellsworth Kelly, he's known for big old solid color canvases. He's a minimalist by far, and really successful, and you see him, and it's one of those things that people need to think about. Not everybody understands it. But all through his career, and I would say that this is probably true of all the artists, that all through the careers of an artist, there are sketch pads. There's a wonderful sketch pad of Frida Kahlo that was published. It was her diary, and photographs of the pages, and there's writing and there's drawing, and so drawing. So here's a man who became famous for painting, minimalist style, and yet all throughout his career he did these beautiful line drawings of plants. And so at the time I came across this, I had gone out after a rainstorm to look for a good rock to inspire my work in Ireland. And I was in a rocky place, rocky landscape, and because of the rainstorm I found a bunch of leaves. And so those two things went together, and I started to do drawings that are very much like these. I have this, and I was going to show, oh yeah, I was going to show something else. It wasn't intentional, but I did this during the same period of time. Those were flowers that were low to the ground among a bunch of grasses and leaves on the ground, and I isolated the shapes of the flowers, and then came back to this book and saw that he had done something similar to that. And then there were things like this, which I think, very elegant and beautiful and very simple. So I started to do some of those. These here, I think I have this one to that way. These two, and I did 8 or 10 of these, were based directly on the leaves that I picked up off the ground after that rainstorm. I spent days with them. I took them back to my studio, laid them on a table, took a picture of it, and started to draw what was on the table. I took the picture because I wanted to be able to remember what they looked like on the day that I found them, because even though they were still there the next day, they were starting to decay and dry out and so forth. So these are drawings of those specific leaves. But I also knew about this, and so it gave me permission to follow that. So when I got to Ireland, I had 2 months. I worked probably 6 weeks altogether of work time in the studio, and I needed to figure out what I was going to do. So my first step, which is back to the thing of what all artists do, is I sat down with my drawing pad and started to draw, do drawings of the things that were around me. There was an old castle tower, there were flowers, there were mountains, And I started to draw some of those things, but not with any idea that I was drawing anything in particular, or that I was going to make anything of those drawings. Just more that I was trying to prime the pump a little bit to get the inspiration flowing. So one lesson that I've learned, when I said in the beginning here today, I know a few things. One of the things that I know, and I could say at least for myself, is that I cannot sit back and wait for an inspiration to come. The inspiration comes while you're working. I need to do that myself. I need to work on something so that out of that ideas come along. So when I was working in visual merchandising, that was always the case. I would always be very busy in the late fall getting wherever I was working ready for the holidays, and I would be working overtime and working really fast and very busy, and the ideas would just pop into my head, more ideas than I could use. Other times of the year when I wasn't so busy, I'd be like, oh my God, I haven't got a single idea. So those stimulations, so I learned that firsthand, that's how that goes for that. I think I just have another minute or two. I decided a couple of months ago to buy this book of an artist that I was not familiar with. I was beginning to feel like I was looking at the same artists all the time. And I have the artists I love, so I'm always happy to look at their work. But I wanted to look at somebody new, somebody in the same genre. So I'm not familiar with this woman except for what I've learned in this book, what little I've had a chance to really look at. She was a Swiss artist. She was working, of course, at the time of some of my other heroes, and did some really, I think this particular piece here that's on the cover is really exciting, really, really cool. But as I float through her book, I see that she has images like this here, but it's applied to a textile over here. And then let me flip another page. Also, very much like Klee, Paul Klee, and from the same period of time, in the same part of the world. Paul Klee was working in Germany, she's in Switzerland. That's almost the same thing. There are parts of Switzerland, of course, that are German speaking and parts that are French speaking, and so forth. I find this intriguing because if there are any of you are Palm Springs Art Museum docents, you might look at this and think that it's Leon Polk-Smith, because he has a piece of work, or the Palm Springs Art Museum owns a piece of his work. Looks an awful lot like that. He came a little later, but still, so were they inspiring one another? Perhaps. I find these intriguing because her shapes are different than the ones you see around much. So, and here, this one reminds me of Miro, that's why I saved this page. Maybe it's the colors, maybe it's these kind of surreal shapes. And then the dots are very cool. I use some circles sometimes in my work, but usually they're circles of, see that on the left, that collage all the way on the left on the bottom? Those are circles that are cut out of old canvases rather than painted on. Although my latest piece has circles on it, and it's out in the gallery. I can just show this one as the last piece. So it's a similar kind of thing to what's on the cover of this book, with the circles but interrupted by these diagonal shapes. So, so there you are. So I put some of my other work behind me because I do go in a couple of different directions. What I notice is that my, and some of this is limited to what's on hand, but my color palettes are very similar to one another in each of these pieces. So my inspiration comes from everything that I see, and hopefully hopefully it's all comes together. But it's when I do it, I'm influenced and inspired by certain people, and I sometimes do things that are pretty much seem like they're copying, which I don't feel like they are. But they're all mine, and they're all me, and so it's sort of like the whole soup of beautiful art, and for me, geometry and colors. So thank you for listening to my goings on here tonight. Have a lovely evening. If you're in the Palm Springs area, come down here to the Backstreet Art District, and I've rearranged all the art in the gallery, so come and see it. Thanks. Good night.